Hey everyone, Tactics here, and I've got another state of video here, this time looking at how melee DPS are looking in patch 9.1. I'll be going over their different strengths and weaknesses of all of the different melee specs, discussing how they stand in both Mythic Plus as well as rating, and also how I think the meta is going to shape up. For those of you interested in ranged DPS, that video should be coming in just a couple days, and I already have videos out on both healers as well as my main role of tank, so feel free to check those out either linked in the description below or over on my channel if you're interested. I'm also going to be releasing a video giving my thoughts on the potential Race to World First raid compositions that might be used by top guilds, and that should be coming out later this week, so keep an eye out for that. Now, before jumping into it, I always want to remind you guys that for the overwhelming majority of players, every single one of these DPS specs is pretty much viable for all forms of content, whether you're trying to complete AOTC or get cutting edge, whether you're trying to get KSM or complete all your plus 20 keys. All of these specs I'm about to talk about are more than capable of completing that form of content. On top of this, there actually isn't currently a catch-all best DPS spec, I would say. All the different specs kind of have different strengths, different pros, different cons, which can make them strong in certain situations and bad in others, whether that be like boss-to-boss situations or dungeon-to-dungeon differences in Mythic Plus, for example. And so the different melee are just kind of good at different things, and a thing you're going to see me talk about a fair bit is actually the flexibility between the different DPS classes. Right, so obviously classes that have more DPS specs available to them are going to tend to be a bit more flexible than classes that don't have other specs available. So if you're looking to be more of a class specialist as opposed to a spec specific player, then these specs, or these classes rather, that have multiple DPS specs tend to be a better option, at least in general. With that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to be notified when I post more Warcraft content. And let's start with a spec that was getting stacked quite a bit in Castle Nathria with Death Knights. Now, going into 9.1, there is of course the one major change to all Death Knights, and that is the nerf to AMZ, now being capped based on what the Death Knight's max health and versatility is, with the current formula being 150% of the DK's max health, with a versatility modifier. So if you have something like 10% verse, the modifier becomes 1.1. You have 20% verse, it's 1.2, etc. And so DPS DKs, they tend not to be a big fan of verse, so if we assume something like a DPS Death Knight with 50 to 55k HP and 5 to 10% verse given the new gear in patch 9.1, a kind of conservative estimate for what the AMZ absorb cap is going to end up being, for DPS DKs, not blood here, is around 80k on the actual absorb cap, and since it's a 20% DR, you can multiply that by 5, so the total mitigated magic damage you can expect is about 400,000 from a DPS DK. Now in Mythic Plus, that changes pretty much nothing, right? For 5 people, that works out to be an 80k shield per player, and you're likely not going to break that, and very, very rarely maybe, but in general, it's going to be the exact same as it was in Season 1 for Mythic Plus. Now, in raids, that's a bit of a different story, because now if you try and just cram all 20 of your raiders, assuming Mythic Raid, of course, into that shield, it's only going to mitigate about 20,000 damage per player, which is, I mean, significantly less than it would have in the past, obviously, and it's going to be less than half of people's health, maybe less than a third of people's health, depending on the class. And so I think it's likely you're going to see a change in how the CD is used. Probably, if I had to guess, either on small groups of people, like when like 4 or 5 people are taking significant damage, or even possibly splitting your raid group into half with 9 people in each, because I'm assuming you're excluding your tanks from this, because your tanks usually aren't in danger. And so excluding your tanks, you can split this up with 2 DKs, 9 people in each group. Obviously, that requires a bit more coordination, so this is something top-end guilds might end up doing, but maybe lower-end guilds will not. But that drastically increases the absorb cap per player to be over 40k, and that's quite useful, definitely more useful than the 20k in raids. So even after the nerf, it's still a usable cooldown. Now, when it comes to their damage profile, you've got 2 specs here that excel in different areas, which, I mean, that's always great to see. That gives you some flexibility, again, as I mentioned. Unholy has the great single target burst, as well as the ability to do uncapped AoE, whereas Frost is much better at the sustained cleave and AoE scenarios, and they also have that 2-minute AoE burst as well. In general, for raid progression, I think Unholy has been the preferred and is likely going to remain the preferred spec because, again, strong single target damage. They have a solid damage profile. They're prime targets for externals like PI, like Conqueror's Banner, to be paired with their Army Burst. And on top of this, they just have one of the stronger executes in the game that Frost doesn't have access to. And execute damage is another one of those profiles that is very, very good in progression content. Frost definitely still has his niches though. Like we saw fights like Huntsman, right? Sustain 2-target cleave. Fights like SLG, both fights that were also unimportant execute phases. So if you're willing to play both DK specs, you're definitely going to be at an advantage to players that are only willing to play one, because again, the flexibility is there. They do different things, they excel in different areas, so it's really, DKs are a solid choice right now for raiding. They're also generally very durable. They have plenty of defensives and self-healing, right? AMS, we saw do some really, really great things in Castle Nathria, so it can be very, very helpful for your raid in that sense. On top of that, Death Grip, I think, is a bit underrated often. Great utility, worked on several fights again in Castle Nathria, and looking at the new fights, it's again going to be a great little utility tool to have going into Sanctum of Domination. Mobility can be a bit of an issue for Death Knights at times, at least, but there's also some situations where an ability like Death's Advance is really, really beneficial, right? Think Artificer, they were able to deal with that scary overlap like no one else could. I think Denathrius, right? They're able to not get any stacks in phase 1. So it's really hit and miss on whether their mobility is going to be bad on a fight or really, really good because of Death's Advance. I think an example is like KT in the new raid. In the Phylactery phase, you'll be able to pretty much ignore those wins, which is really, really nice. So hit and miss on the mobility, but in general, they're a little niche when it comes to how Death's Advance will work. Overall, though, very solid spot and raid content, and they're going to remain a strong choice in 9.1, even though a lot of people are kind of saying the end is near with the AMZ nerfs. Now, when it comes to dungeons, I think DK's dropped down a bit to like the middle of the pack area, right? AMZ loses a ton of value in Mythic Plus, even though, again, it's pretty much unnerfed version of Mythic Plus. It's just not as great. There's much fewer spots where you can get good value out of it. On top of this, outside of the previously mentioned Death Grip, they really don't have much in the utility department when it comes to dungeons, with many other classes just bringing a lot more value. Just like raids though, currently Unholy is the go-to spec for 5-mans, but with Frost kind of rising through the ranks at the moment, I think it'll be interesting to see if Frost ends up surpassing them in terms of dungeon content. Now, alright, strengths. So, again, so they're able to do single target burst, and that's more Unholy's thing, as opposed to Frost. But of course, Frost has that cleave / AoE, and that's more of a Frost thing. They do bring AMZ. It is still real. It is still relevant. I'm still going to put it there. Unholy has the execute damage. Execute damage is still very, very sought after for raid content, especially progression raid content. So it's still something that is very, very beneficial. Death Grip, again, good in both raids and Mythic Plus. A lot of people underrate it in raids, but it's still very, very good. They're durable, big durability, and of course I am going to mention again flexibility, because you have the choice to shift between Unholy or Frost depending on which is better if you so choose. Now, in terms of negatives, mobility, of course, as I mentioned, though again, caveat is Death's Advance sometimes just makes it better for them. And of course, for dungeons, they're lacking a bit on dungeon utility. Alright, moving on, let's talk about rogues. Another class with some flexibility, as 3 different specs to choose from here. Though with current tuning, you're likely only going to be choosing between Assassination and Outlaw. For Mythic Plus, they remain one of, if not the best, melee choice in general, and you're likely to stay Outlaw for this kind of content, which brings an extremely consistent damage profile in all situations, excelling specifically in 5-target cleave, but still holding their own in single target. For Assassination, you might see some niche uses, depending on certain dungeons and your comp, but in general, I'd expect the best spec for dungeons to remain Outlaw. Regardless of what spec you choose though, rogues come with an insane amount of dungeon utility, with Shroud for skips, tricks to help out your tank a bit, tons of different stops, right, CCs and blind and sap, basically just a ton of different powerful tools that kind of explains why they've been near the top of the 5-man meta for as long as they have. Similar to Death Knights, they're also extremely durable. They've got a ton of self-healing from an Endurance Conduit as well as Crimson Vial. They've got Feint, they've got Evasion to help reduce damage intake, and they even have an immunity in Cloak, which can completely negate certain mechanics, both in raids as well as in Mythic Plus. Speaking of raids, I think Assassination is looking very, very good, moving into 9.1 after the buffs in 9.0.5, excelling in both single target scenarios as well as two target cleave scenarios. On top of this, they also have access to execute damage with Zoldix to give them some, like one of the better execute damages available to any of the classes in the game, which, as I mentioned, extremely beneficial in progression rating. Similar to the Unholy Frost dynamic, if you ever need more AoE damage for whatever reason, you can always go Outlaw, but currently Assassination's tuning in damage profile makes it just much more desirable in general in a raid environment. The one major downside I would say of Rogues is that outside of Cloak potentially allowing you to completely cheese and negate a certain raid mechanic, they pretty much have no raid utility. They're a melee DPS spec with no raid cooldown, no raid buff, nothing like that. So if you're bringing a Rogue, at least at the highest levels, you're bringing them pretty much strictly for their damage output and their damage profile. And even though their tuning is great right now, that doesn't necessarily guarantee their spot at the top of the rating scene, because they also have a bunch of ranged DPS to compete with, right? They can't just be the best melee, they have to be the best in general. That being said, for rating as a whole, I think Assassination is extremely strong, and just as Outlaw is strong in Mythic Plus. So if you like both forms of content and are fine playing two different specs, this is a great melee DPS option. So we have single target / cleave for Assassination, and then you have cleave / AoE for Outlaw. You got something like an immunity and Cloak. They have pretty solid durability, as I mentioned. Good in both Mythic Plus and raids. They have, at least Assassination has access to execute. And yes, I know, I believe it's not technically the best overall DPS option, but in terms of progression rating, in a lot of fights, it's pretty much the choice because it gives you damage when you need it most, and that's what's more important, right? Your overall damage does not matter. You want to kill the boss. That execute damage will help with that, and so it's very, very good to have that at least available to Assassination Rogues. Flexibility, just like I mentioned with Death Knight, they can switch to a different spec if they so choose. Very, very good. In terms of lacking, raid utility, definitely not great. And that's really the main thing that they're lacking, right? They're just damage bots at the moment. With Rogues done, let's move on to Windwalker Monks, who, unlike the previous two classes we just talked about, they have no DPS fallback option, right? This kind of leaves them in a bit of a scary spot. They end up being undertuned for any reason, which they have been multiple times in the past. One thing that is currently helping them out, though, is Mystic Touch, basically mandatory for high-end rating, and that's likely not going to change, at least in this expansion. So they've got that going for them. In terms of their damage profile, Monks are great at kind of sustained AoE damage, maybe slightly proc dependent, but they're still very, very, very good. And as of right now, they're probably the best 2-minute burst damage class in the game, thanks to their combo of something like Weapons of Order and Zwen. Being the best at some sort of damage profile in the game usually is beneficial, so I'm sure Monks will find a way to get into the raid environment, especially because it is burst related, right? So you need that monk buff. I think is very, very likely. At least the top end guilds are going to get that monk buff from a Windwalker because, again, being the best at something, very, very good. On the other hand, one of their major struggles in raid is their single target damage, but currently I think their burst upside combined with you needing one monk in your raid is going to make up for that. That doesn't even take into account the fact that they're pretty much unkillable with tools like Karma, Dampen or Diffuse, Fort Brew, and they have insane mobility as well with Freedom in Tiger's Lust. They got a Self-Port and Transcendence on top of their rolls. So overall, they have a lot of things going for them. In terms of 5-man content, I think Windwalkers are in an even better spot going into Season 2 than they were in Season 1, as they're absolutely shredding the meters in a dungeon environment, right? So lots of AoE all the time, which is kind of where they excel. On top of this, as well as the durability and mobility I just mentioned, they have a ton of powerful dungeon-specific utility with things like a Dispel, an AoE stun, Ring of Peace, just a lot going on for them that's really, really beneficial, and it's going to make them very strong in dungeons. I think it's definitely possible for them to get out of that sort of fringe meta spot they found themselves in Season 1, particularly with the rise of something like Prot Warriors doing much, much better. The pretty solid synergistic core group could contain a Prot Warrior, a Windwalker Monk, and an Outlaw Rogue. So it'll be interesting to see how everything turns out for them, but I think they're in a really good spot going into Season 2 in both 5-man content and Mythic raiding. Now, let's do this. So they have that 2-minute burst damage, 2-minute burst. And in general, just solid at AoE. On top of this, they bring a raid buff. Very important to note, raid buffs are important. They also have a ton of durability, a ton of mobility, and a ton of dungeon-specific utility. Now, outside of that, they do have a little bit of struggle in single target. Single target dam. Bit of a struggle there. And of course, unlike the previous 2 specs, not much flexibility. Your only option for DPS here is Windwalker themselves. Moving from one raid buff spec to the next, we've got Havoc Demon Hunters, who we didn't really see a lot of in 9.0, and they were honestly really struggling at the beginning of the expansion, right? Some buffs in both 9.0.5 and 9.1 are really helping them out, though, giving them one of their biggest problems has been single target damage, and they're upping that a tad bit. I think with these buffs, Havoc are likely going to regain their raid spot in top end guilds, replacing Vengeance as the source of that Demon Hunter raid buff. A big reason for this is the fact that Havoc gets Darkness, while Vengeance doesn't. So even if Havoc is slightly subpar, the fact that they bring both a raid buff and a defensive raid CD means they have a ton of value outside of the actual damage they bring. They're also quite mobile, and they bring the pseudo immunity in Netherwalk, which isn't quite a true immunity, but in a lot of situations it does act like one, so it's definitely still valuable in both raids and Mythic Plus. Now, while their single target damage is definitely still a bit on the lower end, they do end up getting some insane numbers in burst AoE situations, largely due to timing your Unbound Chaos use as well. So if we look at Mythic Plus, I think that's why a lot of people are getting onto the Havoc hype train. But I think obviously they're in a better spot than they were in 9.0, but I don't quite see them breaking into the 5-man meta for a few reasons. First, Vengeance still has a ton of value in dungeons if you want to bring the magic debuff in a caster comp, and while Havoc has the darkness advantage, Vengeance has its sigils, which are significantly more useful in 5-man content, right? Darkness loses value just like AMZ does in 5-man content. That's not quite as good, and the sigils are just insanely valuable. Second, if you're looking to bring a DPS spec that is solid in AoE, and you don't mind losing out on a bit of single target damage, the previously mentioned Windwalkers are definitely a better choice right now, with them being, again, the best 2-minute burst spec in the game, as well as them just having better CD timings compared to the Demon Hunter, which has the 4-minute meta, which is a little bit cringe, as well as just better overall utility. With that said, let's write down what we got here for Havocs. So, burst AoE. Very, very strong burst AoE. They've got solid mobility. I'll put immunity down for them as well. Again, it's a pseudo immunity, but in a lot of cases it does act like an immunity. They have a raid buff, of course, and they have darkness. Very good in raid content. In terms of downsides, single target damage, just like monks. And flexibility. Next up, we have Retribution Paladins, yet another single DPS spec melee class, so of course you always run into the risk of not having a fallback option, though Red is in a solid spot right now. Primarily, their strength is having solid burst damage in both AoE and single target, and I think a good way to think about them is kind of like a half measure between Unholy Death Knight's single target burst and the AoE burst of Windwalker Monks, kind of serving like a middle ground. It can be both a blessing and a curse, as it makes them a solid overall choice in both raid encounters and dungeons, but it pretty much never makes them the best choice. Some of their losses to these specs, though, on the damage front can be made up for with their strong utility, as they have the standard array of Paladin support spells like Bop, freedom, sack, as well as access to their own personal immunity, like a couple other classes that we've already mentioned. They technically bring a raid buff, though this hasn't really been a major positive for them in Shadowlands due to the state of Holy Paladin, right? They're so good right now, so pretty much every top-end guild already has a Holy Paladin, so they already have that raid buff covered. For raids at least, another thing in their favor is having access to Ashen Hollow, which adds on to their already strong burst and just gives them an opportunity to provide some additional strong off-healing. It's likely Kyrian is going to be better in Mythic Plus content, but for raids and especially for top-end guilds, it's extremely difficult to try and justify not picking Ashen if it's available to you. For Mythic Plus content, I think they're a bit underrated at the moment, with their main problem again being the fact that they're not quite at the top when it comes to burst damage, and also the fact that things like sustained AoE and cleave damage is at much less of a disadvantage in dungeon content compared to raids. And so specs like Windwalkers, right, they have the advantage in burst. Specs like Fury, they have the advantage in overall damage, even though they're more of a consistent damage spec. So I'd still say that Ret is a top 5 melee spec when it comes to 5-man content, but with there only being 3 total DPS slots, and also there's range DPS to compete with, I think it's extremely unlikely that they're going to be able to push themselves into the meta given their current state. So what do we have here for Ret? Burst Dam. They do big burst. They also have strong utility, right? The Paladin utility tools, great in both dungeons and raids. On top of that, they have a raid buff, like I mentioned. Usually doesn't impact very much for raid content because you normally already have a Paladin, but I will still put it there for them. They also have an immunity. Very, very helpful in all forms of content as well. In terms of what they lack, they're definitely struggle a bit when it comes to mobility, just having Steed really available to them, which can hurt them in a lot of situations. And again, just like our last two, they don't have that flexibility, right? They only have Ret available to them for DPS, so they're definitely hurting in terms of that. With Ret Paladins done, now we've got Warriors. Now, they just started out the tier a bit slow, but of course, we've recently seen the rise of something like Nightfey Fury, just having super consistent damage, obviously better in AoE than single target, but they still also have execute damage to help partially make up for that. Arms is also getting a few buffs in 9.1, which will certainly cement them into their kind of niche of being the 2-target spec, and may even push them to be the best Warrior single target spec, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. For raids, this is yet another class that gives you at least a little bit of flexibility if you're willing to play both specs, which again, I think is a great strength for any class to have, especially if you're someone that's looking to only play a single class in the next patch. They also bring solid bonuses to a raid group. They have the raid buff in Battle Shout, and they also have a decent raid cooldown in Rallying Cry, giving them a ton of value to their raid group outside of just the damage they provide. I also did want to spend a little bit of time just mentioning the potential of Venthyr Fury in raids now, as their new legendary Sinful Surge basically lets them have 100% uptime on Recklessness during their Condemn windows, so above 80% and below 20% on the boss, which could be very enticing given how important having good execute damage has been in the past for high-end raiding content. When it comes to dungeons, though, I think Nightfey is probably just going to be your best option. Again, just being able to consistently pump out AoE damage, always nice to have. You always know what you're getting. Their one major downside is the lack of dungeon utility. Rallying Cry kind of being in the same situation as Darkness, as AMZ, where it's a lot less valuable in Mythic Plus content than it is in raids. And outside of that, Warriors really don't have too much going for them in terms of what they offer to a group. Battle Shout can be hit or miss depending on your group comp, and even that is kind of in the same spot as Rallying Cry, where it has way more value in a raid environment when you're buffing up more players as opposed to a dungeon environment where you're only going to get at most like 2 or 3 players. Overall, I'd say damage-wise, Warriors are in a really good spot right now for both raids and Mythic Plus, and they bring a lot of important things to raids that will make them very sought after in that kind of environment. But for 5-man content, I think they lack a bit of utility, which is likely going to leave them on the outside of the meta when it comes to melee DPS. So, we have, of course, raid buff. Alright, Battle Shout, very, very good. Wish Shout, they also have Rallying Cry. And we also have either sustained AoE or Fury, or you have 2-target cleave for arms. They also have strong execute damage. Very important in progression environments, as I've mentioned multiple times. And of course, like our first two specs, they have that extra bit of flexibility. In terms of downsides, the main thing for sure has got to be their dungeon utility. They really don't have too much going for them on that front. So definitely something to keep in mind. All right, here we go. Survival, Enhance, and Feral. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get a few angry players of these specs in the comments because I didn't separate them, and I don't have too much good to say about them, but I'm going to try and stay away from the whole these are meme specs argument, and instead try and explain why these three specs are in the position that they're in the meta, and it's all for similar reasons, actually. Also, a reminder, again, if you enjoy these specs and you really want to play them, 100% go for it. As I said at the beginning of the video, you will totally be able to complete things like a plus 20, like CE, all those things, definitely completable by these specs, but at least in their current state, they have an extremely low chance of becoming meta specs, and hopefully I can help explain why. Now, I do want to say, before getting too far into it, it was actually very hard to find kind of reliable, unbiased information on these specs, so I will say that my level of knowledge on these three in particular is a little lower than I'd like it to be, so instead of trying to go into too many specifics about what they do and provide, I'm going to instead try and focus on their general issues. So like looking at raid content, for example, there are two major problems that all three of these specs share. Number one, no meaningful utility, right? No raid buff, no raid CD, even just something unique that only they can do, nothing. The closest thing any of them has to this is Wind Fury Totem from Enhance, which basically relies on another spec in something like Arms Warrior being strong to kind of justify bringing it. Number two, all three of these are melee specs that also have a range spec as part of the same class that brings all of the same tools and in many cases more tools. Again, with the only exception being Wind Fury Totem. This kind of leaves these specs in a bit of a weird spot where they not only have to have a significant advantage over their ranged sister spec to be considered, but they also have to beat out every other spec in the game, ranged or melee, because they are quite literally only being brought for their damage output. Basically, you're at the mercy of tuning, but it's even worse because you have no extra utility to potentially make up for poor tuning, and then there's another spec right there that can bring all of the same utility you bring, which it's a situation that personally I would never want to really be in. Again, I'm not saying these specs are bad, right? Like Feral Druids, for example, one of the top single target DPS specs in the game, actually. Problem is, Shadow Priests exist, Assassination Rogues exist, and both can do things that Feral DPS can't, right? Rogues have Cloak, right? And they're a spec that I say have bad raid utility, but they have Cloak, right? That's more than what Ferals can really offer to a raid outside of their damage. For Survival, there's currently whispers that they're going to end up being the best Hunter spec in 9.1, and now I don't know how accurate that is, but even if it's true, they're still just a middle of the pack DPS spec that's very squishy and doesn't bring anything unique. For Enhance, again, all they're really going to bring right now that's unique for them is Wind Fury Totem, which relies on other melee specs being strong, because in pretty much every other situation, they lose out to Elemental on damage. So even though they do actually have something going for them in strong dungeon utility, well, Elemental also has all that same utility, and you know what, they have more, right? They have Earthquake for knockdowns, they have Ancestral Guidance. So why bring an Enhance? Feral's the same story. Great dungeon utility, but Boomkins have Trents, Boomkins have Ursul's Vortex, and Typhoon. They don't have to choose. Boomkins have Innervate, so even if Ferals were a bit better than Boomkins in dungeons, but when it came to damage output, they still lose out badly when it comes to utility, right? So I don't think any of these three specs are inherently bad, but they have some extremely standout negatives that generally makes it hard to justify bringing them over other specs in the game, at least in higher end content. Again, higher end content, repeating myself here, they are perfectly fine and capable in all forms of content, but in terms of making it into the meta, it's just not likely to happen for these specs unless there's some major changes that happen, right? So if we look, I mean, it's not going to apply to all of them, right? So we have things like squishiness, right? Ferals, not too squishy, but both Enhanced Shaman and Hunter, they're quite squishy, right? And these aren't going to be blanket statements because there's three here at one. I'm running out of space, as I'm sure you can tell. I'm sure this definitely will not get clipped out of context and people say, he called Feral Druid squishy? No. Squishy applies to kind of Survival and Enhance, right? They're a little bit more squishy, right? They all have ranged counterparts. with the exact same utility and more, right? All of them, even I think they might all just have more utility in every aspect. If you go Ellie to Enhance, Boomkin to Feral, MM or BM to Survival, and that's just a bad spot to be in. That's just a bad spot. I'm putting this in strengths, but this should be under weaknesses. There we go. Just general utility, right? Right. Again, the only distinction being Wind Fury Totem. Nothing they really have else besides from that is unique utility. Flexibility is interesting here. So if you're like, yeah, I'm willing to play the raid any spec of the class, sure, flexibility is up here, right? You can swap to a range spec. None of these other DPS specs can do that. That's very flexible. On the other hand, if you're like, I'm a melee DPS for life, then, well, flexibility goes down here because that's your only choice, right? So that really kind of depends on what kind of player you are, what you're willing to do. I'll put it in the middle for now, I guess. If we try and bring everything together, where do all the melee DPS kind of stand right now? So for raids, I think Unholy, very, very strong right now. They're still going to have a spot even after the AMZ nerfs. They still have solid tools, right? Strong single target burst, strong execute damage, Death Grip for utility, and Frost is always a solid choice if you want cleave or AoE. Alongside Unholy, I think some of the raid buff specs, namely Windwalker, Havoc, and Warriors, are all in a really good spot when it comes to mythic content, thanks to things like Darkness and Rallying Cry for Havoc and Warriors, as well as just being the best 2-minute burst spec in the game for Windwalkers. They've all got a bunch of stuff going for them, and I think it's likely for these two that they're going to be the source of their raid buff as well. So they're looking very good in raiding content. Rogues are in a solid spot damage-wise in both raids and dungeons, though they're lacking a bit on the utility front in raids, which could lead them to being passed up in favor of another spec, but their dungeon utility is often irreplaceable. Now Rets, again, a bit of a half measure at the moment, being good at both single target and AoE burst, but not quite the best at either, and so while they have solid overall damage output, I don't think they're going to break into the meta in either raids or Mythic Plus. Lastly, the major problems with Enhanced, Survival, and Feral all remain very real going into 9.1, and unless they get some major improvements in either their damage or unique utility of some sort, things likely aren't going to get much better for them anytime soon. But that does wrap up this talk on how all melee specs are looking going into 9.1. Remember guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to be notified when I post more Warcraft content. As I mentioned, if you're interested in how healers and tanks are looking, you can find those videos linked in the description below or on my channel, and my video on a ranged DPS should be coming out in the next couple of days. Also, if you want to keep up to date with me, you can always check me out on Twitch at Tactics, where I stream Mythic Raid content, as well as high Mythic Plus keys and more, all from a tank POV. That's all for now though. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.